Most people are still looking at the fighting between the United States and Iran as if the old script remains intact. Washington leads, Israel supports, and the rest of the region reacts. But the battlefield, the legal framework inside the United States, and the political timing in both countries now suggests something more important. The roles may be shifting. For years, any serious confrontation scenario with Iran was built around American primacy. Israel was a critical partner, often the most forward and capable regional ally, but still not the state expected to carry the central burden alone. And that assumption is now under pressure. The reason is not only military, it is also legal and political. And within the United States, the president's freedom to sustain military action is constrained by the war powers framework. And those limits matter when a conflict begins to move from short-term strikes into a longer campaign. That legal pressure creates strategic space. If Washington faces growing domestic resistance, and if congressional scrutiny becomes sharper, Israel may find itself moving from partner to spearhead. In other words, the military equation is being shaped not only by missiles and air defenses, but by the architecture of American law. Recent signals from Israel point in that direction. Israeli officials, including the defense leadership, have publicly indicated that the country is prepared to resume military operations against Iran if necessary. That is not casual rhetoric. It suggests that planning has moved beyond contingency language and into operational readiness. Earlier, President Donald Trump established a 2-week ceasefire with Iran, creating a temporary pause in open escalation. There was discussion of a possible extension, but no clear timeline was provided. That ambiguity left all sides in a holding pattern, and holding patterns in the Middle East rarely stay stable for long. The ceasefire did not affect only Washington and Tehran. It also placed limits on Israel, including constraints on action connected to armed groups in Lebanon, yet events on the ground did not become quieter in a way that matched the political language of de-escalation. Armed forces in Lebanon continued to apply pressure and, according to reports referenced in the broader debate, even attacked international peacekeeping personnel, causing casualties among French soldiers. That meant Israel faced a practical dilemma. It could formally remain inside the logic of a ceasefire while still confronting attacks that demanded a military response. As a result, Israeli airstrikes in the area did not simply disappear. On paper, the ceasefire remained. In reality, the operational environment kept deteriorating, and that gap between diplomatic language and battlefield reality has become one of the central facts of this crisis. The longer that gap persists, the more likely it becomes that Israel will decide it cannot wait for Washington to resolve its own internal debate. If Israeli leaders conclude that deterrence is eroding and time is favoring Tehran, they may judge that a larger campaign is preferable to continued drift. That is the strategic threshold everyone is now watching. The confrontation between Israel and Iran has long moved beyond ordinary rivalry. It is framed by both sides as a matter of long-term survival, deterrence, and regional order. Even though Iran's constitution does not contain a formal clause calling for the destruction of Israel. Many past statements by senior Iranian political and military figures have reinforced the perception in Israel that the threat is existential, not rhetorical. That matters because existential threats produce different strategic behavior. States become less willing to tolerate ambiguity, less patient with incremental escalation, and more likely to favor preemption. Once that psychology takes hold, every missile stockpile, every enrichment report, and every political delay begins to look like part of a larger design. Across the Atlantic, and the American political system is far from unified. Critics within the Republican camp, including public commentators such as Tucker Carlson, have argued that military action against Iran reflects excessive Israeli influence over American policy. But the structure of the relationship is more complicated than that claim suggests. Historically, the United States has been the central patron and strategic backer, while Israel has depended heavily on American military, technological, intelligence, and diplomatic support. Since Israel's founding, Washington has repeatedly provided the decisive weight behind Israeli power. That pattern is visible across decades of Middle Eastern conflict. Earlier Arab-Israeli wars demonstrated how external backing could alter the battlefield. In moments when Israel faced serious pressure, American and British support helped shift the balance. In later conflicts, Israel's military superiority was increasingly tied to sustained Western assistance in weapon systems, intelligence, architecture, and operational integration. For that reason, the idea that Israel simply drags the United States wherever it wants to go misses the hierarchy of power inside the alliance. Israel has influence, certainly, but when it comes to a war with Iran, Washington still holds the final gate. That raises a central question. Why has a serious attack scenario against Iran come so much closer to realization under President Donald Trump than under several previous administrations? Israel has wanted stronger action against Iran for years, especially against what it views as the central strategic threat in the region. Yet earlier American and European leaders remained cautious. Their caution was based on one basic calculation. Iran is not a weak state that can be struck without consequences. It is a regional power with enough military capacity, proxy networks, energy leverage, and escalation options to turn a limited operation into a broad and costly conflict. Even so, the military balance between the United States and Iran remains highly unequal. In the current confrontation, American losses have reportedly been very low compared with the scale of damage absorbed by Iran. The imbalance has reinforced the view in Washington that Tehran does not possess peer-level military capacity against the United States, even if it retains enough capability to impose pain and prolong conflicts. Examples from prior operations have also shaped that view. In one case often cited in strategic discussions, an American pilot who went down inside Iranian territory was successfully extracted. For planners in Washington, such episodes reinforce a belief in superior battlefield control, rescue capacity, and force projection. Until recently, Israel mostly acted alongside the United States in efforts directed at Iran. Even during the recent 12-day phase of conflict, the two countries functioned as a tightly coordinated military partnership. But a ceasefire without trust is not peace, and the current pause has not resolved the underlying issue. President Donald Trump has continued to sound optimistic about negotiations. Iran, by contrast, appears to be stretching time. That delay may not be simple hesitation. It may be a strategic bet that political change inside the United States could eventually reduce the pressure on Tehran. From Tehran's perspective, time may offer leverage. If internal American politics shifts, if congressional resistance grows, or if electoral calculations weaken the White House, then today's military pressure could become tomorrow's exhausted policy. Iran does not need immediate victory if it believes strategic patience can fracture the coalition confronting it. Israel sees that possibility clearly. That is why its defense leadership has been issuing harder signals. The message is not only that Israel can attack, it is also that Israel is strengthening its defensive posture at the same time preparing for escalation in both directions. That combination matters. An actor that is only threatening attack can still be bluffing. An actor that is preparing attack and defense simultaneously is usually much closer to execution. Tel Aviv appears to be moving toward a posture in which independent action is no longer a theoretical option. One of the reasons the Middle East remains permanently combustible is the missile equation. Iran and armed groups in Lebanon control large arsenals ranging from many thousands to potentially far more, depending on the category of rocket, missile, and launcher being counted. What matters is not only the inventory, but the ability to launch in concentrated waves. Those forces have fired toward Israel many times in the past, causing real damage and forcing Israel to spend heavily on layered defense. At the same time, Israeli retaliation has usually imposed much heavier costs on Iran and its associated networks. The exchange has, therefore, been asymmetrical in immediate damage, but still dangerous in strategic effect. Another notable development is the apparent completion of target selection inside Israel. Public signals suggest that a future campaign would not stop at military bases or missile depots. It could also extend to the political and command structure of the Iranian system itself. Senior commanders in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are widely viewed as priority targets. In some assessments, even top political figures, including the president or senior legislative leadership, are no longer excluded from conceptual strike planning. Whether such targets would actually be authorized is another question, but the fact that they are discussed shows the scale of escalation under consideration. Energy infrastructure is part of the same picture. Israel is believed to be weighing not only military decapitation options, but also attacks on economic foundations such as power generation and vital energy facilities that would move the campaign beyond coercion and toward systemic weakening. Yet military readiness does not automatically mean immediate action. The key variable remains American approval. The fact that Israel is still waiting for a political signal from Washington says a great deal about the real balance within the alliance. This is where many popular narratives collapse. The claim that the United States is merely being pushed forward by Israel does not fit the evidence very well on the issue of a large-scale war with Iran. Washington still acts as the final decision maker, and Washington's position has been hardening. The Trump administration increasingly frames Iran as a threat that must be contained decisively, especially in light of concern over the nuclear program. In this view, delay is dangerous because every delay is treated as time bought for enrichment, dispersal, concealment, and strategic bargaining. Iran continues to deny that it intends to build a nuclear weapon. Officials in Tehran have repeatedly rejected claims that the country is stockpiling highly enriched uranium for bomb production, but older statements implying that the option could be pursued if necessary have made those denials less reassuring internationally. That contradiction between official rejection and strategic ambiguity is now one of the main drivers of escalation. Once open conflict begins, the value of political assurances falls sharply. States stop asking what the other side says and start asking what it could do before the next dawn. At this stage, many analysts believe the conflict has already crossed the normal threshold of deterrence signaling. It is moving toward a more decisive and potentially more destructive phase. For Israel, the objective appears to be widening from retaliation to structural degradation of Iranian power. That may include pressure on the system associated with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, not only on military installations. It may also include direct attacks on economic infrastructure in order to weaken the state's ability to sustain confrontation over time. President Donald Trump once said that American force could send Iran back to the Stone Age. Now, the concern in the region is that Israel may be preparing to operationalize part of that logic itself. At the same time, Washington has not abandoned diplomacy. President Donald Trump still appears to hope that negotiations can force Iranian concessions without requiring indefinite American military commitment. The problem is that Tehran does not appear to be entering talks with comparable urgency. Instead, Iran seems to be trying to outlast the moment. That strategy is tied directly to American domestic politics. If the balance in Washington changes, or if legal pressure on the president intensifies, then military momentum against Iran could slow down dramatically. That is why the next stage of this crisis is not determined by the battlefield alone. It is also being shaped inside the United States by the War Powers Resolution, the legal mechanism that limits the president's ability to continue military action without congressional approval. What happens in Congress may now influence what happens in Tehran, Tel Aviv, and across the Gulf if Democratic lawmakers persuade even a modest number of Republicans to support new restrictions. The White House could face growing pressure to scale back or halt direct operations. In that case, Israel has already indicated that it is prepared to assume the lead role. The conflict would not necessarily end. It would simply change hands at the top. American politics is now deeply divided over a simple but consequential question. Can the president continue this military campaign on existing authority, or must he obtain explicit approval from Congress? Once the legal clock runs down, that dispute is not procedural trivia. It is one of the hinges on which this entire crisis may turn. Since President Donald Trump initiated military action, Republicans have repeatedly blocked Democratic efforts to use war powers, mechanisms to force an end to the campaign. Several proposals have already failed, but Democratic opposition has not stopped, and the legislative contest is still unfolding. Additional bills have been introduced to limit the ability of the United States to wage war against Iran without fuller authorization. If any of them gain traction, they could become serious constraints on future planning. The war, in that sense, is being fought both in the Middle East and inside the American constitutional system. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to return to the origin of the War Powers Resolution. It was created in 1973, at a moment when the United States was still carrying the trauma of the Vietnam War. The damage was not only military, it was psychological, social, and political. The scale of casualties, the length of the conflict, and the growing public backlash created a powerful demand for institutional restraint. Congress wanted to ensure that no president could commit the country to prolonged military engagement without legislative oversight. That was the atmosphere in which the law was born. The War Powers Resolution was passed by overwhelming margins. It required the president to notify Congress within 48 hours after deploying American forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities were likely. Without formal authorization or a declaration of war, military operations could continue for only 60 days, followed by no more than 30 additional days for withdrawal. Those deadlines created a legal framework intended to place war-making under shared constitutional control. Congress retained the power to declare war, while the president retained commander-in-chief authority. The law was designed to manage the tension between those two roles, though it has never eliminated that tension. There is also an important distinction between declaring war and conducting military action. In practice, the United States has fought many campaigns without formal declarations of war, including major counterterrorism and Middle Eastern operations. Presidents have often relied on narrower legal rationales to preserve flexibility. When the law was passed, President Richard Nixon strongly opposed it. He argued that Congress was intruding on executive authority in a way that could weaken the country's ability to respond to threats. He vetoed the legislation. Congress overrode that veto, and that override remains a defining example of how the American system can limit presidential war powers. When legislators are determined enough, the law took effect and remains in place today, although disputes over interpretation have persisted for decades. And interpretation is the key word. A law can exist on paper while presidents search for ways to narrow its application. One of the clearest examples came during the Obama administration in the Libya campaign. In the spring of 2011, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton defended the administration's position before Congress. The White House argued that the military operation in Libya did not require full congressional authorization because it was limited in scope and therefore did not trigger the most stringent constraints of the War Powers Resolution. That was the legal theory. The administration also emphasized that the campaign was being conducted within a North Atlantic Treaty Organization framework. According to that argument, The United States was not acting alone as the primary war initiator, but participating in a broader alliance operation. This was presented as one reason the conflict should be viewed differently under war powers logic, but the facts on the ground quickly complicated that claim. The United States carried out more than 1/4 of the total sorties, provided roughly 3/4 of the aerial refueling missions, and supplied about 1/4 of the aircraft involved. By September of that year, the share of American combat aviation activity remained substantial, around 1/4 overall. Beyond direct strikes, the United States furnished much of the campaign's essential backbone: weapons, basing, logistics, support systems, and key enabling assets. In practical terms, Washington remained the core pillar of the operation. So the claim that the American role was merely limited invited obvious criticism. The legal problem intensified when the 60-day mark arrived on the 20th of May, 2011. Under the War Powers Resolution, that was the maximum period for continuing military action without congressional approval, yet operations continued beyond that point. The White House defended itself by arguing that command had shifted to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and that the American role had become more restricted. Critics responded with two basic objections. First, a state that provides the bulk of the critical resources can hardly be said to be peripheral. Second, transferring nominal command does not erase substantive leadership. The debate soon spread across Washington. It became one more chapter in the long struggle between the executive and legislative branches over who controls military commitments, even when the law is not enforced to its absolute limit. It still creates political exposure. That exposure became visible on the 3rd of June, 2011, when the House of Representatives voted by 268 to 145 to condemn the President Barack Obama for violating the War Powers Resolution. The vote was largely symbolic, but symbolism in war powers debates is not trivial. It records institutional judgment and warns future administrations. The consequences carried into the Syria debate in 2013. After the experience of Libya, the Obama administration approached Syria with intervention in mind. But Congress reacted more forcefully. Lawmakers refused to grant the desired support and even moved to block the deployment of American forces into that theater. That episode showed how congressional attitudes could shift after perceived executive overreach. Many members of Congress had already believed that conflicts such as Libya and Syria did not directly touch core American interests. The administration, by contrast, framed intervention partly around broader political transformation and democratic aspirations in the region. This difference in strategic thinking widened the divide between Congress and the White House. Even where military action remained possible in limited ways, the political legitimacy of such action became increasingly contested. The war powers question had become more than a legal detail. It was now a battle over national strategy itself. Despite criticism under the War Powers Resolution, the United States did not fully disengage from Syria. Under both Barack Obama and later Donald Trump, American presence persisted in part because of counterterrorism operations, especially against the Islamic State, which had seized extensive territory and destabilized multiple states. The current Iran situation resembles those earlier cases in one important respect. Once again, a president is operating in a gray zone between urgent military action and uncertain congressional support. But there is also a major difference this time. In earlier campaigns, Washington could point to a wider coalition, particularly the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the present confrontation, the states standing clearly at the front are essentially the United States and Israel. The lack of broader Western participation makes the political burden heavier and the legal debate sharper. A notable moment came on the 28th, when President Donald Trump coordinated with Israel in conducting airstrikes against Iran. He justified the action as necessary to protect American bases in the Middle East and defend national interests, framing it as a form of collective self-defense. That rationale was immediately contested, but it established the administration's public position. At first, Washington reportedly hoped to bring in additional partners such as Britain, Germany, and France. That did not happen. European governments judged that the conflict did not directly concern their immediate national interests and chose to stay outside the military line of action. This left the American campaign more isolated politically. Inside the United States, Democrats moved quickly to challenge the legality of the operation, while the White House and most Republicans argued that, and the action still fit within the permissible bounds of the War Powers Resolution. The disagreement was immediate, but the deeper issue was time. Under the law, the President has only 60 days for military action without congressional authorization, followed by up to 30 days for withdrawal. That clock is now central to every calculation. As the deadline approaches, Washington will be forced to choose between escalation, retrenchment, or direct confrontation with Congress. The options before President Donald Trump are stark. The first is to seek congressional approval to continue the campaign. In theory, that would provide a stronger legal basis and greater strategic clarity. In practice, it appears difficult. Democrats are opposed, and even within the Republican Party there are voices uneasy about a prolonged war, especially under rising political pressure. A request to Congress could therefore expose weakness rather than consolidate authority. The second option is more realistic and therefore more important. The United States could reduce or end its direct combat role while continuing to support Israel from the rear through weapons transfers, intelligence, logistics, and other military assistance that falls more comfortably within executive authority. This is the scenario receiving the most attention. Israel has already signaled that it is willing to assume the lead role if needed. Given its long experience with sustained regional conflict and its substantial military capabilities, Israel could continue large-scale operations against Iran, especially if American backing remains steady. This would preserve pressure on Tehran while reducing some of the domestic burden on Washington, but it is not a clean solution. A prolonged Israeli campaign aimed at degrading Iran could intensify regional tensions and draw sharp criticism from the international community, even if direct intervention by other powers remains unlikely. Diplomatic pressure and political costs would increase. For President Donald Trump, however, that model offers one clear advantage. It could lower domestic political strain at a sensitive moment in American politics. The burden of visible war would shift outward, even as influence remained American. There is also a middle course. The administration could continue military operations within the legal limit and then use the additional withdrawal window to intensify strikes in order to secure an exit on favorable terms. That would mean a final surge of force before drawing down. Such an approach would carry serious risks. It could be portrayed as an unnecessary escalation just before withdrawal, raising both moral objections and international criticism. It might also fail strategically if a stronger final blow triggers a broader retaliatory response. Everything now depends heavily on the diplomatic track. If negotiations with Iran begin producing tangible movement, the White House gains room to claim success without indefinite military commitment. If talks continue to stall, pressure will grow on both Washington and Tel Aviv to rely more heavily on coercive options. That is the true shape of the present crisis. It is not simply a question of who can strike harder. It is a contest between military capability, legal limitation, alliance hierarchy, political timing, and strategic patience. The old model placed the United States in the center and Israel in support. The emerging model may invert that order, at least operationally, if American legal and political constraints tighten. Further, should that happen, the conflict will not become smaller. It will merely be prosecuted through a different lead actor. For Iran, delay may still look rational. For Israel, delay may look dangerous. For Washington, delay may become legally unsustainable. These are not the same clocks, and that is precisely why the situation is so unstable. What happens next will be decided not by one speech or one airstrike, but by the collision of several pressures at once: Iranian calculations, Israeli readiness, presidential authority, congressional resistance, and the fading value of temporary ceasefires. The next phase may arrive quietly, then all at once. For now, the ceasefire still exists in name, the military preparations remain active, the American legal deadline keeps advancing, and in that narrowing space between law, diplomacy, and force, the balance of roles between the United States and Israel may be changing in real time.